I mean, let's be honest. I mean, Mexican immigrants who come here basically share our value system. That is not true necessarily with the immigrants who are coming into Europe. I mean, I don't know of any Mexicans who want a theocracy, but there are many Muslims who come from theocratic societies. Yeah. I mean, it's very hard. It's harder to assimilate them. You know, who wants to hire someone at Supercuts and wearing a burqa?
And now the crisis.
No one wants their hair cut by an invisible lady. I think I know that.
Let's get one thing straight. Western secularism is not a timeless truth. It's not a philosophical North Star. It's not the final evolution of reason. No. Western secularism is a coping mechanism, the political equivalent of chain smoking after a really bad breakup with the Catholic Church. But try telling that to a French bureaucrat, and you'll be accused of blasphemy. Against the Republic, of course. The irony. The myth goes like this. Once upon a time, Europe was trapped in the dungeon of dogma, ruled by popes with infallibility complexes and kings who thought they were God's interns. Then, like a phoenix rising from a pile of burning heretics, the Enlightenment arrived. There was light, there was reason, there were powdered wigs. Humanity emerged from the Dark Ages, and the secular state was born, pure, rational, benevolent, and finally free from the grip of divine absolutism. That's the bedtime story, and like most bedtime stories, it's full of selective memory, suppressed trauma, and colonial projection. Because what actually happened was this: Western Christendom imploded. Not because it was too religious, but because it turned religion into a monopoly. The state and the church fused into a theocratic Frankenstein, and when it all went to hell, Europe responded, not with balance, but with overcorrection. It didn't reform religion, it banished it. It didn't create tolerance, it constructed a new orthodoxy called neutrality, which conveniently excluded anything with a whiff of minarets or modesty. And then the West had the audacity to export this trauma as a cure. As if Algeria needed laïcité, as if Egypt's problem was too much piety and not enough Rousseau. You see, Europe didn't secularize because it was more enlightened. It secularized because it had a nervous breakdown. Islam, on the other hand, never had to. Because it never turned its theology into a weapon of state tyranny. It never needed to declare war on its own metaphysics. This discourse isn't just a critique, it's a deprogramming. A reminder that Western secularism is not universal. It is historically contingent, ideologically narrow, and deeply colonial in how it travels. Let's rewind the clock. Picture Europe. Not the cafe-sipping, metro-riding Europe of today, but the cold, muddy, candle-lit nightmare of the Middle Ages. No printing press, no antibiotics, no electricity, and certainly no separation of church and state. What there was a colossal institution, a towering, all-consuming, ironclad machine of thought control. The church. Not the church in some vague spiritual sense, no. The church as an imperial bureaucracy, a metaphysical monarchy, a divine ministry of truth. You see, when Constantine converted to Christianity in the 4th century, he wasn't adopting a religion, he was weaponizing one. He took the message of a humble Jewish prophet, flipped it into an imperial ideology, and chained it to the throne. Rome baptized itself and called it salvation. And from that moment on, Christianity stopped being a path to God and became a license to rule. The church wasn't a side character in European politics. It was the state. Popes crowned emperors, priests wrote laws, bishops commanded armies. And if you disagreed, if you had the audacity to think differently, to ask the wrong questions, or heaven forbid, to suggest the earth might orbit the sun, then the church had an answer for that too. The Inquisition. Let me paint you a scene. A man stands in front of a tribunal, his hands shackled, his manuscripts burned. His crime? Using a telescope. His defense? Quoting Aristotle. The verdict? Heresy. The punishment? Prison. Or, if the mood struck them, fire. This wasn't a one-off case. It was the rule. Giordano Bruno, burned alive in 1600 for suggesting that the universe might be infinite and that other worlds might exist. Heresy. Why? Because a limitless cosmos threatened a god who was supposed to live upstairs. Humiliated, forced to recant, sentenced to house arrest for daring to argue that the Earth was not in fact the center of the universe, because apparently scientific observation was a bit too Protestant for the Vatican's liking. For centuries, intellectual life in Europe was strangled by a theological straitjacket. Philosophy became an echo chamber. Theology sat on the throne while reason fetched its wine. Scholasticism, the great academic movement of the Middle Ages, was less about discovery and more about rearranging the same 200 thoughts approved by the Church into slightly different theological origami. They debated how many angels could dance on the head of a pin, while Baghdad, meanwhile, was calculating the circumference of the earth. As the Catholic Church entrenched itself in medieval Europe, it didn't just offer salvation, it constructed a political infrastructure. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, the Church filled the power vacuum. By the time of Charlemagne's coronation in 800 CE by Pope Leo III, divine right had become political doctrine. Kings weren't simply rulers. They were consecrated by God through the Church. Disobedience wasn't just a civic transgression. It was spiritual treason. This sacralization of monarchy formed the basis of what would become the Corpus Christianum, a fusion of church and state where the Pope crowned emperors and emperors protected popes. The result was a theocratic scaffolding that spanned centuries. The papal states ruled territory. Bishops sat in royal courts. The Church controlled vast landholdings. By the 14th century, it owned roughly 1/3 of all land in Western Europe. It levied tithes like a state collects taxes. Canon law rivaled civil law. The Inquisition, launched in 1231 under Pope Gregory IX, institutionalized surveillance and punishment of thought. Dissenters, from Cathars to Waldensians, were exterminated not just as heretics, but as enemies of order. Science, philosophy, and even basic literacy were bound by ecclesiastical permission. Knowledge was monopolized. Printing, once invented in the 15th century, was immediately regulated. The Protestant Reformation, which Martin Luther began in 1517, wasn't a polite theological disagreement. It was a volcanic eruption after centuries of ecclesiastical corruption. Protestants split from Catholics. The Holy Roman Empire fractured. England broke from Rome. France descended into religious civil war. Between 1520 and 1648, Europe was set ablaze by a series of religious conflicts so bloody they made the Crusades look like a bar fight. The crown jewel of this chaos was the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. It was the deadliest conflict in European history until the World Wars. A continent-wide bloodbath that began as a religious dispute in Bohemia and ended with cities depopulated, economies shattered, and entire regions turned into mass graves. Over 8 million people died because Protestants and Catholics couldn't agree on who Jesus preferred. The Peace of Westphalia, signed in 1648, didn't end the war because anyone had won. It ended it because everyone was too tired to keep killing. This was the backdrop, the burned-out ruins of Christendom, into which the Enlightenment thinkers arrived. They weren't climbing a ladder toward truth. They were crawling out of rubble, desperate to prevent another collapse. Let's be clear. Hobbes, Locke, Voltaire, Rousseau, these weren't prophets. They were first responders. Take Thomas Hobbes. Traumatized by the English Civil War, he looked at human beings and saw only chaos, selfishness, and violence. His solution? A Leviathan, a strong secular sovereign to impose order. Not liberty, not democracy. Order. He wasn't dreaming of freedom. He was trying to tranquilize a hysterical civilization. Now John Locke, the liberal darling, he did speak of rights, liberty, tolerance. But when you zoom in, the exclusions are clear. His tolerance didn't apply to Catholics, whom he viewed as loyal to a foreign pope, or atheists, who allegedly couldn't be trusted to keep oaths. He didn't believe in universal equality. He believed in selective protection. And let's not forget, Locke invested in the Royal African Company. Yes, the slave trade. The man who wrote about natural rights also wrote ledgers of human cargo. Voltaire? Sharp, witty, relentless, a genius who mocked religious tyranny but was, himself, a cultural elitist. He admired Islam's rational theology, but used that admiration mostly to embarrass the church, not to engage with Islam seriously. And when it came to the Jews, Voltaire's writings were laced with contempt. The Enlightenment, let's be honest, had its own prejudices. It just didn't wear robes. Then there's Rousseau, the philosopher of the general will, who inspired both liberal democracies and totalitarian nightmares. He believed society was corrupt and virtue could only be restored through collective sovereignty. But collective sovereignty, without moral restraint, easily becomes mob rule. The pattern is clear. What unified these thinkers wasn't some universal truth. It was a shared historical trauma. They were trying to rebuild civilization after Christian absolutism wrecked it. And so they built a new paradigm, one in which religion was privatized, reason was sanitized, and the state became morally neutral, in theory at least. But here's the key insight. This was not a discovery of truth. This was a containment strategy. Secularism was not about liberty. It was about managing a dangerous memory. It was designed to keep religion in a box. Not because faith is inherently bad, but because European faith, fused with state power, had turned genocidal. In short, Europe didn't choose secularism out of clarity. It stumbled into it out of necessity. And yet, centuries later, the Enlightenment was retroactively glorified. Its thinkers became mythologized. Its trauma was rebranded as progress. Its strategy of self-protection was marketed as civilizational maturity. And that's where the historical fraud begins, because the West then projected its own pathway onto everyone else. It looked at civilizations that never had inquisitions, never had popes with armies, never burned scientists alive, and said, "You too must secularize, or you will never be free," as if secularism were a universal cure, not a local scar. If Western secularism was the child of religious trauma, then Islam never birthed that trauma in the first place. That's the real scandal of global modernity, the one no one wants to talk about. Because for over 1,000 years, Islamic civilization functioned without a pope, without inquisitions, without crusades against its own thinkers, and without religious wars that devoured half the continent. Islam didn't separate mosque and state to survive, because it never fused them into a Frankenstein to begin with. Let's be clear, Islam had political power. It had rulers, dynasties, even empires. But what it never had was a church. No Vatican, no centralized priesthood, no theological monopoly, no institution with the power to anathematize you into hell and jail you in this world while they were at it. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was not a priest-king. He was a messenger, yes, a statesman, yes, but never a divine right monarch. After him, there was no infallible pope, no office of holy correctness. The caliphate was a political institution, not a theocratic throne. And the ulama, the scholars, they were not priests. They were jurists, theologians, interpreters of law. And unlike the clergy of medieval Europe, they had no monopoly over salvation, power, or state violence. They earned authority through scholarship, not ordination. You couldn't buy your way into their ranks. You had to study grammar, logic, jurisprudence, hadith, theology, philosophy. That's the first civilizational difference. And it's massive. Let's go deeper. Europe's problem was that religion became politics, and when it failed, both collapsed. In Islam, by contrast, the political and the spiritual were conceptually linked, but structurally separate. Take the development of fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence. This wasn't written by kings or governors. It was built by scholars in mosques and madrasas. Entire legal traditions emerged from intellectual debate. Hanafis in Kufa, Malikis in Medina, Shafi'is in Cairo, Hanbalis in Baghdad, These weren't state-imposed codes. They were community-developed bodies of law, pluralistic by design. And they disagreed, openly, on everything from ritual purity to the death penalty to commercial law. But disagreement in Islamic tradition wasn't heresy. It was an inevitable and even celebrated feature of jurisprudence. "Difference of opinion in my ummah is a mercy," said the Prophet. Meanwhile, Europe was stabbing each other over whether Christ's presence in the Eucharist was literal or symbolic. Let's talk philosophy. Europe locked up its philosophers. Islam funded them. Baghdad's House of Wisdom was not just a library, it was a civilizational project. Muslim scholars translated Greek philosophy, Persian medicine, Indian mathematics. And they didn't just translate, they engaged. Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, Ibn Rushd, Averroes. These weren't rebels. They were integrated into the intellectual fabric of their societies. Even when there was tension, like the famous clash between Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, it was intellectual, not inquisitorial. No one was burned at the stake. No one was tortured in a dungeon for quoting Aristotle. They wrote books, not charge sheets. And it wasn't just abstract metaphysics. Muslim societies pioneered astronomy, medicine, algebra, optics, chemistry, historiography, and more, all in the name of understanding the universe as God's creation. Faith did not suffocate reason, it energized it. There's a reason why, from the 8th to the 13th century, the Islamic world was the intellectual engine of the planet. Cities like Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, Nishapur, Bukhara, Samarkand, these weren't just capitals. They were centers of learning, with scholars from every sect, language, and discipline debating, teaching, and exchanging manuscripts. Paper itself became mass-produced in the Islamic world centuries before Europe caught up. Now contrast this with Christendom. In Europe, to even suggest that the earth orbited the sun could get you tried for heresy. In the Muslim world, Ibn al-Shatir, a 14th century Damascene astronomer, laid out heliocentric-like models a century before Copernicus, without being arrested. This is not to say Muslim societies were utopias. No one's romanticizing. There were despots. There were orthodoxy enforcers. There were episodes of book burning, especially under reactionary rulers. But these were exceptions, not systemic norms. There was no equivalent to the church locking all theology behind Latin walls and executing dissenters for unlocking the door. Even the structure of Islamic governance differed fundamentally. The caliphate, or later the sultanates, had no claim to divine right. They were legitimate only if they fulfilled the Sharia. And the Sharia, importantly, was not state law written by kings. It was an independent, scholar-produced moral legal tradition. The ruler implemented it, but he could not rewrite it at will. This created an organic separation of powers long before Montesquieu. Not a separation of religion and state, but a separation of state and religious authority. The sultans had swords, the ulama had pens, and the two often clashed. This structure, ironically, protected Islamic societies from the kind of theological totalitarianism that Europe became allergic to. There was no absolutism of belief enforced by law. You could be a Sufi mystic, a Kalam theologian, a rationalist Mu'tazilite, or a strict Hanbali literalist, and still find space in the Islamic world. Until, of course, colonialism came. But we'll get to that. For now, understand this. Islam didn't separate faith and reason because they never collided. It didn't banish religion from politics because it never allowed it to become a monopoly. And it didn't need a reformation or a renaissance or a scientific revolution to recover lost glory, because it had those things while Europe was still accusing cats of witchcraft. That is the forgotten fact. Islam produced political theory without papal bulls. It produced rational theology without atheism. It produced legal institutions without secular constitutions. And it achieved civilizational brilliance without amputating the sacred from the public sphere. So when Europe, emerging from its own collapse, turned to the Muslim world and said, "We have discovered the one true path, secularism. You're welcome," it was not offering a gift. It was prescribing therapy to a patient who was never sick. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe had stabilized, not entirely, but enough. It had silenced the church. It had declared sovereignty to reside in man, not in God. It had reframed religion as private sentiment and not public truth. Secularism was installed as the firewall against relapse. But something else had happened too. Europe had discovered ships, and cannons, and markets, and colonies. And as it marched across the world, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, it didn't just bring muskets and missionaries. It brought its philosophical assumptions, disguised as universal truths. It carried secularism not as a local adaptation, but as a civilizational prescription. And no one received this prescription more forcefully than the Muslim world. The problem was simple. Islam had power. Islam had its own political and legal structures. Islam had a public religion that was not ashamed of itself, that made laws, that organized life. And for the colonizer, who had spent centuries wrestling the church to the ground, this was intolerable. Because in the Western mind, religion plus power equals inevitable tyranny. That was its own history. So when it looked at Islam, it saw not an alternative, it saw a mirror, a distorted, dangerous reflection of its own worst nightmares. This is what made Islamic governance and Sharia so threatening, not because they were oppressive, but because they were confident, because they worked, because they were rooted in a tradition that had never burned a Copernicus, never gagged a Galileo, never crowned a pope with a sword. And so, under the banner of civilizing missions, European empires launched a massive project, the secularization of the Muslim world. Let's start with the British in India. After crushing the Mughal remnants and defeating Tipu Sultan, the last serious Islamic political resistance, they began restructuring Muslim society from the ground up. They dismantled the Qadi courts, Islamic courts run by trained jurists. They replaced them with Anglo-Muhammadan law, a Frankenstein hybrid of Sharia, selectively filtered through British common law, interpreted by colonial judges who didn't read Arabic, and who often misunderstood the very principles they claimed to apply. The Waqf system, Islam's charitable endowment network that sustained education and welfare for centuries, was brought under state control. Madrasas were defunded. Ulama were sidelined. The spiritual infrastructure of Islamic society was gutted, not because it failed, but because it wasn't secular. Now cross over to the Ottoman Empire, once the most powerful Islamic polity in the world. In the 19th century, under pressure from European powers and internal reformists, it embarked on the Tanzimat reforms. These reforms, modeled on European law, introduced secular courts, Western-style legal codes, and civil bureaucracies that began to marginalize traditional Islamic jurisprudence. The Sharia wasn't abolished, but it was domesticated. From being the framework of society, it was reduced to personal status law, marriage, divorce, inheritance. Everything else, commerce, criminal law, politics, was handed over to imported codes. Fast forward to Ataturk, the final blow. In the 1920s, Mustafa Kemal abolished the caliphate altogether. He shut down the religious schools. He banned the Arabic call to prayer. He criminalized Islamic dress. He Latinized the script. He adopted Swiss civil law. He wasn't reforming Islam. He was purging it from public life, from institutions, from memory. And in the name of what? In the name of modernity. Which, in reality, was just Western post-traumatic ideology wearing a tuxedo. The same logic played out across the Muslim world. In Egypt, Nasser championed secular Arab nationalism. Religious institutions were placed under state control. Al-Azhar, once independent, was nationalized. In Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba banned fasting during Ramadan for civil servants. In Iraq and Syria, The Baathists tried to clone European secular authoritarianism with disastrous results. But none of this was framed as repression. No, it was liberation. Liberation from superstition, from backwardness, from ourselves. Secularism wasn't offered, it was imposed by colonizers who believed they were liberating us from the horrors they had once inflicted on themselves. This is what philosopher Saba Mahmood called the colonization of consciousness, not just the colonization of land, but of assumptions. Secularism as moral superiority, as inevitability, as truth. But what they called modernization was, in many cases, just epistemicide, the killing of alternative ways of knowing. And at the center of that crime was Islam, a civilization that never needed secularism, being forcibly reprogrammed to believe that it did. Somewhere along the way, the West forgot its own scars. It began to believe the myth of its own enlightenment. That secularism, originally a desperate compromise hammered out in Europe's scorched fields after centuries of holy wars, witch burnings, and excommunications, wasn't a bandage but a crown. That it wasn't a response to disaster, it was the telos of human civilization, the final destination, the finish line. And so, in the 20th and 21st centuries, secularism mutated. It went from protection from religion to policing of religion. Let's be blunt. Secularism today is not neutral. It doesn't float above belief like some philosophical referee. It has a side, a culture, a psychology. And increasingly, it acts less like a philosophy and more like a dogma, a Protestantized, post-Christian, moralizing ideology with a strange allergy to visible Islam. Let's take France, the self-declared temple of secularism, laïcité. Laïcité was born in the early 1900s to break the grip of the Catholic Church over education and the state. It was reasonable, necessary even. The Church had meddled in politics for centuries, and the French Republic finally pushed back. But now, laïcité has become a secular inquisition, not against church power, but against Muslim visibility. In 2004, France banned hijabs in public schools. In 2010, it banned face veils in public altogether. In 2016, the burkini, a swimsuit, was criminalized on beaches under the logic that it violated secular space. Let that sink in. A woman covering her body in the name of God is now a national threat. Meanwhile, Catholic nuns can walk down the street in full habit, and that's considered charming, cultural, historic. But a Muslim woman in a headscarf, that's oppression, radicalism, barbarism. Why? Because secularism, particularly in France, never really made peace with religion. It just beat Catholicism into submission, and now channels that unresolved rage onto the nearest public theology it can find. Islam became the new stand-in for the church, a mirror, an echo, a convenient projection. This is not secularism. This is ideological displacement. This is the West exercising its demons on someone else's faith. Let's zoom out. In theory, secularism separates church and state. In practice, in most of Europe, it now means the state can define which religions get to appear in public, and how. Consider Switzerland, where minarets were banned in 2009, or Denmark, where Quran burnings are protected speech, but public prayers are suspicious, or Quebec's Bill 21 in Canada, which bans public employees from wearing religious symbols. A Sikh teacher, a Jewish judge, a Muslim policewoman, all excluded. In the name of what? Neutrality. But neutrality doesn't ban identity, it protects it. This is not secularism. It's cultural erasure with a legal brief. And here's the punchline. This neo-secularism still carries the fingerprints of Western Christianity. It's Protestantism, just without the Trinity. It privileges private belief, personal spirituality, and internal conscience. because that's what Protestantism emphasized against Catholic ritual and public display. So the ideal religious subject in a secular state is one who believes privately, speaks vaguely, dresses normally, doesn't quote scripture in public, doesn't act like their religion matters in law, politics, or foreign policy. In other words, a liberal Protestant without Jesus. Now enter Islam, a faith with law, ritual, public obligations, community ethics, dress codes, economic prescriptions, political memory, and a 1400-year tradition of visibility. In the secular imagination, Islam isn't just a religion, it's a problem. Why? Because it doesn't fit the Western post-trauma template. So Islamophobia today isn't just racism, it's secular PTSD. Muslims aren't burning scientists. Muslims aren't demanding theocracy in Paris. But the visibility of Muslim belief triggers a latent memory in the West. Religion equals power, equals blood. In France, the government launched a charter of imams. Think about that. A secular state is writing a doctrinal guide for Muslim clerics. Can you imagine the outrage if Pakistan issued a charter of bishops for Catholic priests? And here's the most tragic part. The West has forgotten why it adopted secularism in the first place. It wasn't to sterilize public life, it was to prevent religious violence, to protect citizens from coercion, not from conviction. But today, it protects no one from violence, not the Palestinians bombed with impunity, not the hijabis harassed in metro stations, not the students expelled for praying on campus, and not the scholars blacklisted for saying uncomfortable truths. What we're witnessing is not the triumph of reason. It's the return of orthodoxy. Only this time, the priest wears a suit, and the heretic is anyone who still thinks God has something to say about politics, law, or justice. Secularism is no longer a shield, it's a sword, and increasingly, it's aimed straight at Islam. Look at the Ottomans, who ruled over Arabs, Turks, Kurds, Greeks, Armenians, and Slavs, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, Sunnis, and Shi'is. In an empire that spanned 3 continents, there was no push for one religious or cultural identity. The millet system gave communities autonomy. Christians ran their own courts. Jews governed their own family affairs. Muslims lived under Sharia. No one was forced into secular sameness. This wasn't secular pluralism, it was Islamic pluralism, built not on indifference to religion, but on deep confidence in religion's ability to accommodate difference without coercion. During the Mamluk period in Egypt, jurists fiercely resisted state efforts to monopolize religious law. In Mughal India, Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi challenged Akbar's attempts to blur Islam with a universalist state religion. The Prophet, peace be upon him, is reported to have said, "There is no obedience to a creation if it involves disobedience to the Creator." This is not the logic of absolutism. This is the logic of principled authority. Islamic civilization developed waqf institutions, privately endowed trusts that supported schools, hospitals, mosques, orphanages, and public works. These were entirely outside state control. The ulema ran education, merchants ran endowments, scholars wrote the law, and this decentralized ecosystem protected the public from both theological dictatorship and political absolutism, long before Rousseau scribbled his first sentence. Compare that to modern secular states. Europe forgot its nightmares. The Muslim world inherited them anyway. That's the tragic irony of the secular modern age. A civilization that needed to forget God in order to survive now demands that everyone else follow suit, regardless of whether their relationship with God ever became toxic in the first place. If you've had your cities razed by religious civil war, you're allowed to be cautious. But what you don't get to do is rewrite your trauma as a blueprint for humanity. Because Islam never had your problem. It didn't need to exile religion from politics, because it never crowned religious officials with imperial swords. It didn't need to separate church and state, because it had no church. It didn't need to murder God to make room for science, because it believed the Quran and the cosmos came from the same author. Islamic civilization built universities before Oxford existed. It built hospitals before Europe could sterilize surgical tools. It debated philosophy while the West still debated whether non-Christians had souls. The truth is, Islam was modern before Europe invented the word, and that's why it was colonized, not because it was backward, but because it was resistant to assimilation, because it had its own model of order, one that didn't require erasing God from law, society, or conscience. So when colonial powers marched in with their flags and rifles, they didn't just extract gold and grain, they extracted worldviews. They didn't liberate Muslims. They just replaced one metaphysical framework with another and enforced it with bureaucracies, bullets, and textbooks. And now, in the 21st century, this secular dogma is crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. Western societies are not becoming more rational. They're becoming more anxious. Loneliness is at record highs. Suicide is endemic. Birth rates are collapsing. Young people no longer believe in truth, in beauty, in purpose. Politics is polarized. Democracy is cynical. And the only thing sacred is the individual's right to redefine reality. And yet, even now, the West demands that Muslims privatize their faith, that they shed their public piety, withdraw from moral debates, and keep the Quran where they keep their childhood fairy tales, in a drawer. But Islam doesn't fit in a drawer. It doesn't retreat when the world is on fire. It offers a complete worldview, from the soul to the state, from the family to the market, from personal virtue to political justice. The Muslim world doesn't need to copy the West's therapy. It needs to remember its own clarity and build from there. Thank you for watching the video. If you liked it or it made you think, consider subscribing the channel and supporting me through Patreon. The link is in the description. Your support would go a long way in enabling me to continue making videos on topics relevant to the contemporary Muslim. If you think that there's a topic that I should make a video on, or a topic that's consequential to the Muslim community and hasn't been given its due attention, please let me know in the comments. Thank you once again.